I've had many injuries and broken neck, broken back, smashed skull. Since that 2-year period, I am scared, not just a little bit frightened, but scared beyond what I even realizing. I made the decision, either do I look at things as a victim or a victor, because it takes exactly the same amount of time. It's not selfish. Forget what society has said. Those rules have gone now. Whatever society and paradigms you have had before which had served you, they're not going to serve you anymore. So whatever you manifest in the mind, actually it reflects in the body. So if you're able to actually, by simple technique of just breathing, that is the go-to thing.
Hello, and welcome to the Geoffrey Eisen podcast. This podcast is about using spiritual wisdom, insights, principles, and practices to integrate and embody into your life in a practical way. My guests share their story of their spiritual journey, as well as how their spiritual beliefs, insights, and practices have helped them live a better life. Their life stories help others understand and accept life's challenging opportunities for learning, expansion, and growth. Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Geoffrey Eisen podcast. My guest today is an extremely special guest. His name is Paul Rogers from Stadstead, Quebec, just on the border of Vermont, about an hour and a half from Montreal. I met Paul on LinkedIn and we had a conversation, and it was truly amazing. Paul's story is certainly an amazing story. It's a story of overcoming trauma and adversity and bouncing back in a very, very special way. Paul's going to tell you a little bit about his story, but I just want to give you the context that we are in the midst of a tremendous world crisis, the coronavirus. And Paul's story, I believe, can be an inspiration to all of us, because we are going through a period of trauma and adversity. And when you hear Paul's story, you'll realize that he had a major adversity to come back from. He's a tremendously positive outlook person. He's come back from the edge, and I know he wants to inspire others. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. It's a sort of privilege to be here, so thank you very much.
Paul, why don't you share with the listeners a little bit about your story? I know it's a story that we could probably take the whole podcast to talk about, but I do want to make sure that we have some time for other discussions. So if you could give us a brief outline of who you are and where you got to where you are today.
For sure. My story really started 2 years ago, where my previous life effectively finished and a new life has started. 2 years ago this month, I was with my family and we were driving in North Quebec, and a train hit the car we were traveling in, which caused catastrophic injuries. My wife and I were on life support for 10 days, and we have woken up from that. I've had many injuries and broken neck, broken back, smashed skull. It's 2 years on, and it's been quite a journey to get to where we are now. And it's been really helped by meeting Geoffrey.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm sure I'm a very small part of that journey. It's hard to believe. I know I chatted with you before, and you told me that it was 2 years ago, but as you're repeating it, that's not that long ago. And here we are in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, and people are talking about the fact that, we've been self-isolating for 2 weeks and 3 weeks. And you had 2 years of fighting to bring your life back together. Share with the listeners a bit about what that journey was like and what got you to where you are today. Because as I mentioned, I have never met a person that has such a positive outlook, certainly considering the trauma that you went through.
Yes, I mean, the trauma itself is 2 years ago, but it would be very nice if I was able to say in a Hollywood type ending that that was that and the film has moved on and we lived happily ever after. The recovery is every single day, and every day there is challenges. I also suffered a severe TBI, which is a traumatic brain injury, and I have chronic PTSD. So every day since that 2 year period, I am scared, not just a little bit frightened, but scared beyond what I even realizing are capable of. And living with fear like that shapes a person. And it's given me a focus, because if I actually gave into it and decided that I was going to be a victim, then for sure I wouldn't be sat here talking. So what I have really decided is that it's not my fault for getting there, but I do have a responsibility for myself to actually improve. And I made the decision, either do I look at things as a victim or a victor, because it takes exactly the same amount of time and the same amount of effort to make that choice. And I suppose I've said I was spiritual before the accident, but I really didn't appreciate or know what that meant. When I woke up 10 days later, during that period when I was asleep, I like to say asleep because it's a more gentle way of describing it. But when I was asleep, something happened, and that I was not actually Paul Rogers, because actually at the time I didn't even know my name or who or where I was. But what really changed was when I started recording and opened my eyes again, I had this burning desire to help others. And it's helped me heal by helping others and speaking to people like Geoffrey, where he's encouraged that thinking and made sense of something which actually I really wasn't too sure what it was.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, Paul, you said that. First of all, I want to comment because it's the first time I've heard victim versus victor. And I love it because the first four letters, V-I-C-T, are the same in both. And in victim, it ends with I'm, right? So I'm the victim. And victor ends with O-R. So there's an or, there's another side, there's an or to this victimhood, and you can choose to be the victor, not the victim. So I love that. I love that play on words. Thank you for sharing that with me. The point you raise is a very interesting one, because often the difference between victim and victor is the outward focus. Because my sense is that if you simply focused on you, right, victim, the I am, the I'm, your challenges would be much greater, because you have lost some brain power, and we didn't really mention it in the beginning, but your wife was in the car and she suffered tremendous injuries, and it was your son, I believe, in the car who was okay.
Yeah.
And your dog actually heroically saved your son and your wife, and so the fact that from that adversity, from that pain and suffering, you woke up with the desire to help others. I truly believe, from a spiritual perspective, you made conscious contact with the source, with the creator, and you were touched in that moment. And I think that, I see that anyway. I certainly didn't go through what you did, but I see that as a tremendous part of your healing. The fact that you could become outward focused, that you could become altruistic, that you could have a desire to help others when you yourself had suffered so much.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, something did happen, it's very difficult to put into words because our vocabulary is so small. It's trying to describe something which is so big. And it wasn't just the fact that I wanted to help others. I then had these channels of creativity. I've written a series of books, and I was creative before the accident, but not to this extent. And I almost feel guilty when other people say, oh, we had writer's block. I had none of that. It literally just poured out of me. And I now realize it may be channeling or something similar, where actually I didn't feel that the effort was proportionate to what the result was. And that is the only way I have been able to square with myself with what is such a destructive event, that if you have something so bad, there is a balance. There's a balance to everything, and that's kind of where we are with the coronavirus at the moment. That yes, it is bad, and it is a trauma, and the word trauma simply means to be overwhelmed. And okay, I kind of did it spectacularly with bells and flutes on, but one person's trauma is trauma, and it doesn't matter. It's not a competition who has the biggest trauma. The feelings and the levels you reach are identical. So what I'm trying to do now is look over my shoulder and leave my hand down to grab whoever is suffering, whether it be financially because of the loss of jobs, whether it be emotionally because of being confined, physically confined. It's all the same, and it's the same feelings, and we are all connected. So it's like a one great big power grid with us all on it. And if you're able to put back into the grid, that's got to go to everyone else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Paul, let me ask you a question because you're right. And I love that point. And be careful, listeners, not to judge someone else's suffering and someone else's trauma. Someone who is living alone and very social could be dealing with a tremendous trauma. And even if they have a nice place to live and they seem to have nice possessions, you could say, oh, why should they be feeling that trauma? Do not judge another person's trauma. We all suffer in different ways. But let me ask you the question, Paul, as you were going through your trauma, if you could have asked people to treat you a certain way, to give you something, to offer to you something, what would it be? Because I think you make a great point, and that is the trauma is trauma. So whether it's the trauma after your accident or the trauma that we are facing because of this virus, how should we be looking to help people that are in trauma?
It's very easy, to be honest. And the good thing about this is it is simple. Sometimes you don't need or want advice, and sometimes you just need to know that somebody is there and is pretty much in the same boat. I mean, the thing about trauma is it doesn't just stay with the initial impact. It carries on. It's 2 years, and I still have days where it's very, very hard to be positive, and that's okay. That's okay, because some days you don't score the touchdown. Some days you just need to move the ball down the field. I believe that President Obama said something similar, or said that, but it's not every day is a little journey, is a little thing. Sometimes even just getting up, having a shower, it's okay. And we have to judge ourselves in a kind way. My first book I released was about how to develop self-compassion. And that's nothing I really thought about before the accident. I didn't need to. But my doctor told me that. And as soon as I started looking at it, I thought, yeah, this is making a big difference. So the first thing I suggest to people is look to see your own self-compassion. It's not selfish. Forget what society has said. Those rules have gone now. You have to look after yourself first before you can look after others. It's kind of why on airplanes, when they do the safety brief, they always show, put your mask on first before you help the others. Well, yeah, because you need to be in a position and a vessel able to do that.
Paul, it's so interesting you say that because any of the listeners that know me would realize that I would say exactly the same thing. And I just want you to know, listeners, we didn't talk about this before. We didn't collaborate. We didn't share this. This is from a person who has gone through that trauma. Okay. And although I have been fortunate that I really didn't suffer a lot of trauma, I had some ups and downs like everyone else. But self-compassion, self-love is huge. It is huge. I believe that you cannot give to others what you do not have yourself. You would not be hearing Paul Rogers with the love and compassion and understanding that I'm sure you sense from his voice unless he went through that process of learning to love himself and be compassionate towards himself. The outward manifestation of this beautiful human being that went through a tremendous trauma 2 years ago is because he practiced that self-compassion. And I want to ask you, how would you advise the listeners to practice self-compassion? What are some of the hints that you could give to people? Because your self-compassion, it must have been a tremendous effort, having lost everything that you lost, and yet, it appears that you let go of the anger, you let go of the blame. Tell us a bit about your journey towards self-compassion and how you can help the listeners certainly use self-compassion in this COVID-19 crisis.
Absolutely. This trauma is going to mark our lives in that people will refer to this as pre-corona and post-corona. So we have to actually, first of all, accept that there is a trauma, because the press is sensationalizing everything. It is scary. There is real fear here. There is real danger. And it's kind of like I feel I've got a 2-year head start on everyone, because I've already adapted my mind and my manner and everything else. So for me, this is not anything new. But to start with, it is entirely new. And the first thing you have to do is realize that whatever society and paradigms you have had before which have served you, they're not going to serve you anymore. You need to find a new set. I remember seeing my psychologist very early on, and he said, "You've never failed." I said, "Well, yeah, of course I've failed. I've had setbacks." He said, "No, you don't understand. This is a failure which you cannot run away from. It's not of your making, and you can't talk your way out of it. It's real, and you've never had that type of toolkit to deal with this." So I set about building this new toolkit, which basically started from the inside to the out, rather than what society and the whole social media, where you pretend you're this great person and everything's fine. That's not going to cut it anymore. If you want to find real power and build what I always saw as the holy grail, which is resilience, the ability to bounce back, you have to start with yourself. And if you are like me, you haven't had to use it until you do need it. And then what you do is you find the strength, which is like a gift you haven't unwrapped. And the more you get into looking at this, when you look over your shoulder, you'll see that all the way through your lives, there has been opportunities and things which you didn't realize were actually gifts. and you've got a whole pile of gifts which is all yours already. You don't have to acquire anything new. And the joy of discovery, of actually finding and unwrapping gifts which you didn't realize you had. I'm just an ordinary guy. I'm nothing special. But what I have found is that actually somebody asked me very recently, would you go back and change it? And do you know what? I said, no, I wouldn't. And it was a big wake up moment for me because no one wants trauma. If you can avoid it and avoid pain, that's what you'll do. But the pain has actually made me who I am, and I'm using it now as a fuel. And it goes back to the very simple decision you make. All events have no emotion. It's what emotion you bring to the event which decides the ultimate path. So I think once you actually start finding gifts, it's kind of addictive because, who doesn't like getting presents? And that's how it starts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that reminds me of a Sheltazar message that says that darkness is our greatest gift, and you certainly have taken your darkness and transmuted it into an amazing gift. And although you say you're an ordinary guy, because in essence, I think we are all ordinary. Even the superstars are ordinary. But what differentiates you is you're an ordinary guy that has done extraordinary things. And we're all capable of that. And hopefully this podcast today and the work that you're going to be doing inspires people to do extraordinary things, because we're all ordinary. But once again, there's that choice. Do you want to do ordinary things, or do you want to do extraordinary things? And you certainly are an example of someone that does extraordinary things. I just want to comment, it's fascinating because as I'm listening to your philosophy, and as you pointed out, you hadn't really looked at things much from a spiritual perspective until, we connected. Everything you are saying is spiritual teachings that I have learned from Sheltazar and that I have learned over the years. And so let's not get too caught up on that word spiritual, because, Paul is sharing with us spiritual wisdom. He's just not calling it spiritual wisdom. He's calling it life wisdom. And sometimes we think of spirituality too much in terms of the invisible and intuition and angels. And, spiritual wisdom is common sense to help us live the best life we can, to help us get through the traumas and the difficulties. Certainly, we are suffering from personal traumas and difficulties now, but the whole world is. The whole world is. And once again, I can't say it enough. Paul is a phenomenal inspiration to me and hopefully to you, that we will get through this difficulty. Listen to the things that Paul is saying. Listen to this podcast over and over again, because he is sharing with you nuggets of wisdom.
And wisdom is actually, it's like, what's a diamond? It's a rock that did well under pressure. And it's the same thing. This nugget of wisdom is experience under the same pressure. And the thing is, every single one of us has it. It's just that we haven't seen it, and we try to draw lines of this ends here, spiritually ends here. It's all merged in, and once you start doing that, and society has told you that if you deal with yourself first, it's selfish, but that just simply isn't true. And it's a shift in what's known as a paradigm. Mm-hmm. And once you actually break free of that, you suddenly find that there's a huge immense of freedom. There's a thing that just popped into my mind. It says the difference between ordinary and extraordinary is extra. So everyone has that extra, and it's a question of just being able to look at it and concentrate on it.
And don't wait for the trauma. Don't wait for the difficulty. Don't wait for the adversity to have to draw upon your extra. We all have that extra. And so why not use that extra before the trauma. Now, as a world, we're going through that trauma. The universe is giving us a little nudge, is giving us a little opportunity. Draw upon your extra so we can become extraordinary. Paul, if you would, I know we didn't take much time going into the story of the accident and how it happened, but in order to give people a little bit more context or perspective, tell the listeners a bit about what you're dealing with, what the aftermath, what are the physical maladies, the physical issues that you are still dealing with 2 years later.
The thing about injuries is that the bones and the mechanical things, they knit back together and repair. What I really didn't appreciate was the length of time. I remember in the early days when my doctor said, well, you've got to be really thinking about 2 years. And I thought, oh, that's ridiculous. 2 years, I've got things I want to do. And I am now just past the 2-year anniversary, and it's entirely true. So the PTSD, which I've never really understood, unfortunately, it's a mental health issue now. And I have something which is noise sensitivity. So what that effectively means in a nutshell is that if I hear a sudden noise or there's a metal or metal noise, I get a flashback, and it's not how you would think a flashback visual because I was unconscious, but I get an emotional, a sensation flashback because even though my conscious brain was unconscious, it still recorded everything which is going on. So and as soon as that happens, if I jumped out now and said, boo, you'd go, oh yeah, and then you'd recover. My sensors don't reset. They stay up at that maximum overdrive, over vigilant for hours. And so you're living in survival mode, which burns your energy at like 2 or 3 times because you're in the flight or fight mode. And it's a constant battle. And I know that every single day, unless I actually shut myself in the room, something's going to happen. In fact, even in the room, if my thoughts turn into try and actually make sense of it, I can have a panic attack all by myself. So that's the negative side, which actually shows how powerful and how unknown and misunderstood the brain is. And again, I go back to what keeps me going on is actually thinking, whatever happens to me, I am hoping that I can reach one other person and it will be a survival guide to pull them through. And Geoffrey makes a fantastic point. It's not a question of you have to reach rock bottom in a trauma. If you feel it coming, you can always build on yourself. There doesn't need to be an excuse. We've been given an excuse, so take it as a gift and a sign to actually focus on what you may have not been doing before.
Mm-hmm. Which is the opportunity of this whole COVID-19, the whole idea of the self-isolation. Yours was not optional. Ours is not optional. You had 2 years, and I hear people being concerned that it's been 3 weeks now, or it's been this many weeks. You had 2 years of recovery. So use that time, that opportunity to make the adjustments in your life. Paul, you mentioned that super sensitivity and how you can't help but get that adrenaline rush. What are some of the coping mechanisms? What are some of the practices and techniques you use to get through that hypersensitivity to noise, or when those thoughts take you down the wormhole?
The thing I've found that helped the most is breathing. It's of course, it's not just the breathing in and out. When you actually are in a hypervigilant state, your heart is beating, your central nervous system is in full flight, and you have to find a way, and I have tried to find a way to ground myself. And how I have done it is literally trying to actually break the pattern by breathing long, deep breaths. And whilst I'm doing it, I can then start to concentrate and find a point to focus on. And everyone's going to be different, and that's fine. But it's getting to the point where you can actually quieten the mind. The body kind of then takes its lead, because whatever you manifest in the mind, actually it reflects in the body. So if you're able to actually, by simple technique of just breathing, that is the go-to thing.
Excellent. Yes,
Yeah.
excellent. Once again, it's so interesting that Paul has come upon this wisdom through his trauma, his physical, mental, emotional trauma, and yet these same techniques and practices are available through so many sources in yoga, mindfulness, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this stuff works, guys. This stuff really, really works. You know, you're hearing it from a man who was in tremendous physical disarray. Tell the listeners a bit about, because I recall from our conversation how many broken bones you had, and what were and not to belabor the negative, but just so that people can understand how far you have come. Tell us a bit about those injuries that you sustained in the accident.
For sure. I mean, to start with, my wife and I were obviously very badly injured, but we have taken very different paths in our recovery. And so that's also a good piece of advice, is that just because one event happens, you cannot guarantee that everyone acts the same. My injuries were that as I spun so hard around in my seat, that it basically broke C1 and 2, which is at the top of the neck, and it then broke all the way across the skull. Both the temporals were broken, and so much so that I've had a 7-hour brain surgery to remove the shattered fragments of the bone from my brain. Nerve 7, which actually runs straight down the middle, was had a huge piece of bone stuck in like an arrowhead. So as a result of that, my right hand side of my face is paralyzed, and I cannot taste on one side. I got to the point now where I don't have to hold my eye closed to go to sleep, so that part works. The back and the neck, this is going to sound really strange, but those broken bones, even though they were painful, they were nothing compared to the pain I had in my head, and it kind of blanked those other ones out. And I met with one surgeon who did the brain surgery, and he said that there was a bone right in the middle of the brain, which is like honeycomb. And he said in his entire career, he'd never seen it broken. And it's so difficult that even in crematoriums, they have to go in with a hammer and break it up because it just doesn't burn away. And yet that was broken. So the injuries, they're impressive. There's a list of who's who. My wife's injury was slightly different in that she had to have a large slab of her scalp removed, which was an emergency operation at the time to let the pressure out. And then she's had that reinserted again. So, yeah, I mean, that's what you call injury. I mean, I've never really broken a bone.
And thank you for sharing that. And the reason I asked you to share with the listeners is so that they would understand the severity of those physical injuries. And we didn't talk about it at the beginning for a reason, because then you would have listened to Paul with a different perspective.
Yeah.
As you listened to Paul at the beginning of the podcast, you didn't quite understand the severity of the trauma, the severity of the physical injuries, because he sounds pretty normal. He sounds pretty with it. He sounds like even better than some of the guests I've had on the show in terms of sharing tips and techniques and practices. And I think it was important here at the end of the podcast for you to realize how far this man has come with his trauma. And if he can do that, then we can get through this collective trauma that the world has. You are a tremendous inspiration for all of us. And I hope I didn't, freak too many people out, because as you were describing so vividly those injuries, it can certainly make people very, very uncomfortable and fearful. And that wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to realize that, when the body's broken, if the spirit is there, we can make a comeback. Okay, we can add the extra and become extraordinary. Paul, it's, the time has gone by so quickly. I'd love to have you back on the show again. Before we leave, please share with the listeners a little bit of self-promotion. Tell them about that book that's available on Amazon. I think there's another one coming out. All of this information will be on the bio in the description of the podcast. I encourage you to check out Paul's material, get in touch with him. He's an amazing individual. I know this is just the beginning of our friendship. Paul, share with the listeners, please.
Absolutely. Thank you. To get hold of me, I'm very active on LinkedIn. It's kind of like my new toy at the moment. And if you're not too sure what I look like, when you come across my photo, you'll see I've got dreadlocks, and there aren't many Paul Rogerses with dreadlocks. So that's me. The book which I have out, which is the first book of how to develop self-compassion, they are actually under a pen name, which is Kate Summers. That is me, and I'm happy to explain to individuals why I've used it. There is a reason, and that is on Amazon.com, and it's a free book, short free book. And the second book is, which is coming out this Friday, is titled, again under the White Wolf series, Easy Changes for a Better Life. And then finally, I have a website, which is www.takeactionacademy.ca, where there's a whole host of other help products, some free, some paid, but it's basically choose your own toolkit. That's what it is, and tailor make it to whatever you need.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. I encourage everyone, as we are going through this self-isolation, what a tremendous offer, a free book on an amazing topic, self-compassion. We certainly could all use some hints and tips on how to get into that place of self-compassion, because when this is over, the world is going to need compassion and empathy. And if you have it within yourself, you can share it. Thank you so much for being an amazing guest on the podcast, Paul. Once again, my name is Geoffrey Eisen, spiritual life coach, channeler of Shaltazar, and an energy intuitive. Thank you so much for listening in to this podcast. I hope you share it with your friends. Until next time, love and light to you all.